Miriam Cross found the deed on the day she was clearing her father's study. Not the day of the funeral, which had been 3 weeks earlier, and which she had moved through with the specific suspension of normal function that grief produced, doing what needed doing in the sequential way of a person who understood that the doing was the only available path through. Not the week after, which had been the week of administrative tasks, the phone calls and the accounts and the notifications, and the forms that arrived in the post with the relentless efficiency of institutions that processed death as a category of event requiring paperwork. The third week, when the administrative tasks had been completed, and what remained was the physical fact of her father's life in the rooms he had occupied, the study with its desk and its books and its specific smell of old paper and the pipe tobacco he had given up 20 years ago, but that had stayed in the walls regardless. Her father's name was Edward Cross. He had been 79 years old and had died on a Sunday morning in October, in the armchair by the study window, in the way he had apparently wanted to die, which was without drama, and in the room he had spent the most time in, and with a book open on the arm of the chair. He had been a historian, not of the academic variety, with institutional affiliation and a publication record, but of the private variety, a man who had spent his life reading and researching, because the reading and the researching were what he found necessary, rather than what he had been employed to find necessary. He had worked for 40 years as a land surveyor, which had paid adequately, and had given him a professional relationship with records and boundaries and the documentary history of land ownership that he had applied to his private historical research with the precision of someone whose professional tools happened to suit his private enthusiasms. Miriam was 51 years old. She had been close to her father in the way of an only child and a widowed father, the specific proximity of two people who had managed a household together after her mother left when Miriam was 14, and who had developed over the 37 years since the particular friendship of people who had been through something together and had come out of it knowing each other well. She was a librarian, which her father had always said was the inevitable outcome of growing up in his house, where the bookshelves covered the walls of every room, including the bathroom and the hallway and the small landing at the top of the stairs. She was clearing the study because the house needed to be decided about. Her father had owned it, fully and without mortgage, and had passed to her under the terms of a will that was simple and direct, and had been drawn up with the methodical care that Edward Cross brought to all documentation. The house was hers, and she needed to decide what to do with it. She was not ready to decide, and was therefore cleaning, while the decision formed at whatever pace it formed at. She was working through the desk. The desk was a large Victorian writing desk that had been her father's for as long as she could remember, and that was in the condition that a well-made desk reached after decades of serious use. The surface worn smooth and marked with the evidence of work, ink in the grain of the wood in certain places, the faint circle left by 30 years of a tea mug placed in the same position. The drawers were organized in the way her father organized everything, with the systematic logic of a man who needed to find things reliably, and had arranged them so that finding was straightforward. She worked through the drawers in order. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a folder of survey maps from his working years and a collection of correspondence tied with string, was the Bible. It was not a surprise. Her father had kept a Bible in this drawer for as long as she had known about the drawer's existence. He was not a religious man in any active sense, but he had a relationship with the book that was historical rather than devotional, the relationship of a person who understood it as a document and as an artifact, and who kept it with the specific care he gave to things he considered worth keeping. She lifted it out. It was heavier than she remembered, which was not because the Bible was heavier, but because she was older, and lifting things her father had owned felt weighted with meaning, in a way that the same objects had not felt before his death. She opened it on the desk. The deed was folded between the pages of the Book of Ruth, folded precisely, in the exact thirds that her father folded documents when he was filing them, which she recognized immediately as his fold, and therefore as something he had put there, rather than something she had found by accident. He had put it there because it was the place he kept it, the place he had always kept it probably, and that she had not known about until this moment. She unfolded it on the desk. The deed was old. Not old in the way of old paper that had deteriorated and required careful handling. Old in the way of well-preserved old paper that had been kept in the right conditions for a long time, and that retained the quality of the original document while communicating its age through the texture and the color and the specific character of the ink. The paper was a heavy linen stock that had been used for formal documents in a particular era, and the ink was the brownish black of iron gall oxidized over time. The date at the top was 1887. She read it. The legal language of the document was the legal language of its era, dense and specific and constructed for permanence rather than accessibility. But she had 30 years of experience reading old documents, and she worked through it with the focused patience that the work required. The deed described a property transfer. The property being transferred was described in the formal surveying language of the period, by boundaries and measurements from fixed points that were themselves described in relation to landscape features, a method that required knowing the landscape to fully interpret, but that was internally consistent and precise within its own logic. The property was described as a residential structure of stone construction on approximately 40 acres of land in a valley identified by a name she did not immediately recognize, Keld Valley, in a region identified as the Northern Uplands, which was the general description applied in 19th century documentation to a large area of northern England that she could not immediately narrow further without more context. The structure was described in the deed as Keld House. The transferring party was named as a firm of estate administrators, acting on behalf of a deceased owner. The receiving party was named as one Thomas Edward Cross. She looked at the name. Thomas Edward Cross was her great-great-grandfather. She knew this because her father had maintained a family history that was one of the secondary objects of his private historical research. A record of the Cross family going back to the mid-19th century that was organized in a folder on the shelf behind the desk, and that she had looked at on several occasions over the years, with the mild interest of someone for whom family history was her father's enthusiasm, rather than her own. She stood up and went to the shelf and found the folder. She read through the family history notes until she found Thomas Edward Cross. Her father had documented him as a stonemason who had worked in the northern uplands in the 1870s and 1880s, and who had died in 1891 at the age of 43. Young enough that whatever he had built in his working life had not been built for long. The family history noted that Thomas had married and had 2 children, and that the family had moved south following his death, to the city where the subsequent generations of Crosses had remained. The family history said nothing about a property. It said nothing about Keld House. She went back to the desk and looked at the deed. 40 acres in a valley in the northern uplands, a stone residential structure, transferred to Thomas Edward Cross in 1887, 4 years before his death. And then, as far as the family history recorded, nothing. No subsequent transfer, no sale, no documentation of what had happened to it in the 137 years since Thomas had received it. She looked at her father's desk, at the folder of survey maps, at the collection of correspondence tied with string. She untied the string. The correspondence was organized chronologically, in the way her father organized correspondence. The most recent letters were on top. She moved through them in reverse order, and the further back she went, the more the letters began to address a topic she had not known her father had been pursuing. He had been looking for Keld House. The correspondence went back 23 years, to letters he had written to historical land registry offices and estate archives and local history societies in the northern counties, asking about a property called Keld House in Keld Valley, and receiving in response a series of letters that ranged from helpful to uncertain, to the specific tone of institutions that had looked carefully and found the record obscure. One letter, dated 11 years ago, was from a land registry researcher named Patricia Holt, who had written that she had found a reference to a Keld Valley in an 1881 ordnance survey map, but that the valley appeared to be in an area of the uplands that had not been extensively surveyed in the modern period, and that the settlement records for the valley were incomplete in ways that suggested the area had been depopulated at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century. She said Keld House appeared in the 1881 survey map as a marked structure, but did not appear in the 1920 survey, which could mean it had been demolished, or could mean it had simply not been recorded in the later survey due to its remoteness and apparent vacancy. She said she was unable to determine the current status of the property. Her father had written back. Patricia Holt had written back. The correspondence had continued for 3 years before Patricia's letters stopped, with a final note from her that said she was retiring and was sorry she had not been able to resolve the question fully, and that the property remained, as far as her research could determine, without any recorded subsequent transfer or sale following the 1887 deed, which meant it was possible, in the specific way that unresolved things were possible, that the 40 acres and whatever stood on them were still technically in the ownership of the Cross family line, the transfer having never been reversed, and the title having never been conveyed to anyone else in the intervening 137 years. She sat at her father's desk for a long time. Then she called her friend Daniel, who was a solicitor specializing in property law and who had been her friend for 20 years, and who answered her call with the easy manner of someone picking up for a person they trusted. She read him the deed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed to make some calls, and that she should sit with the deed until he called her back, and not do anything with it in the meantime. She said she was sitting with it. He said he would call by Thursday. Daniel called on Wednesday. He said he had spoken to a colleague who handled historical title claims, and that the situation was unusual, but not unprecedented. He said that property titles in England could remain technically valid in the absence of any subsequent transfer or legal action to extinguish them, and that the key question was whether anyone had acquired the property through adverse possession in the intervening period, or whether any legal action had been taken to resolve the title, neither of which his colleague had been able to find any evidence of in the preliminary search. He said the practical question was What was actually at the property, given that the last reliable documentary evidence of the structure's existence was the 1881 survey map? He said she was going to need to go and look. She drove north on the Friday. The drive to the northern uplands took 5 hours. She had spent Thursday evening reading everything she could find about the geography of the area Patricia Holt's letters had identified, cross-referencing the 1881 survey map that she had located through an online archive with the modern mapping available on her phone. Keld Valley was real and was accessible, she had established that, via a single-track road that left the main valley road at a point marked on the modern map as an unmaintained track. The unmaintained track was unmaintained in the specific way of roads that had been used at some point and had been left to the landscape since. She drove it slowly and with the attention it required, the track climbing steadily into the fells in a way that separated her from the last visible farmhouse below within the first half-mile and placed her in the specific quality of upland silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different register of it, wind and birds, and the sound of water from a gill somewhere to the left of the track. Keld Valley opened in front of her after 2 miles. She stopped the car at the point where the track crested a small rise and the valley became visible, and she sat for a moment before she continued. The valley was not large, a 1/4 mile wide and perhaps a mile long, the sides rising to the fell tops on both sides, the bottom carrying a stream that was visible as a line of movement in the November light. The valley floor had the quality of land that had been worked and had been left to recover, the field patterns still readable beneath the growth that had reclaimed them, the boundary walls that divided them still standing in most places, dry stone construction that had outlasted the activity it had organized. And at the far end of the valley, set against the rising ground at the valley head, a structure, stone, 2 stories, with the specific presence of a building that had been built to be in a landscape rather than merely placed in one, the proportions and the materials reflecting the valley around it in a way that was the work of someone who had understood both building and place. It was standing. She drove to it along what had been a track, and was now the memory of one, parking where the track ended at what had been a yard. She stood outside the structure and looked at it. The building was in the condition of something that had been empty for a very long time, and had not been maintained, and had survived regardless, because the original construction was the construction of people who built for permanence, and the stone of the uplands was the stone of permanence, and the 2 things together had produced a building that was worn and damaged in specific ways, and intact in the ways that mattered. The roof had failed in sections. The windows were absent, the frames empty. The main door was present, timber, warped in its frame. She pushed it, and it moved, slowly, and with the resistance of something that had not moved in a long time, and then it opened. She went inside. The interior of Keld House was 2 rooms on the ground floor, and a staircase to 2 rooms above. The floors were stone flags, intact. The walls were stone and lime plaster. The plaster failed in many places, but the stone behind it present and solid. A fireplace in the main room with a chimney breast of dressed stone that had been built by a craftsman who knew what a chimney breast was for and how to make one that would last. A second fireplace in the kitchen room with a range alcove that had once held a range and no longer did, the range having been removed at some point, but the alcove and the flue intact. On the first floor, the rooms were smaller, the ceilings lower, the windows oriented to the valley in a way that, standing at the empty frames, made the view of the valley below and the fells beyond into something that she stood and looked at for longer than she had intended. She came back downstairs. She went back to the main room and stood in the center of it and looked at the fireplace and the stone flags and the walls that had been standing since before her great-great-grandfather had received the deed to this place in 1887 and had died 4 years later without, apparently, ever managing to do anything with it except own it. She thought about the deed folded in the Book of Ruth. She thought about her father spending 23 years of correspondence trying to find what the deed belonged to. She thought about Patricia Holt writing that she was sorry she had not been able to resolve the question. She took out her phone and called Daniel. She said she had found it. He said it was standing. She said it was standing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was going to need to begin the formal title resolution process, which would involve a historical land registry search, and a legal application, and a timeline that he could not specify precisely, but that was measured in months rather than years if the preliminary search continued to find no evidence of any competing claim. She said she understood. He asked what condition it was in. She looked around the main room of Keld House, at the stone flags and the dressed chimney breast and the windows that looked out at a valley that had been empty for long enough to have recovered its silence. She said it was in the condition of something that had been waiting. He said waiting for what? She thought about her father in the armchair by the study window, the book open on the arm, the deed and the Bible in the bottom drawer, 23 years of letters tied with string. She said she thought it had been waiting for someone to come and find it. There was a pause. Daniel said he thought that was probably right. She walked to the window and looked out at Keld Valley in the November light, the stream and the old field patterns and the dry stone walls and the fells rising on both sides to the sky. Her father had spent 23 years trying to get here. She had made it on a Friday in November, with a deed folded in thirds, and a phone, and a 5-hour drive. She was going to find out what it meant. She was going to work through the legal process with Daniel, and the historical process with whatever came after Patricia Holt's retirement, and the practical process of understanding what a stone building in a remote valley needed, and what could be done with it. But first, she stood at the window of Keld House, and looked at the valley that the building had been looking at since 1887, longer than any living person had been alive, patient and indifferent, and exactly there. Her father had folded the deed in the Book of Ruth and kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk. She had found it while she was clearing his study. He had known she would find it. She understood, standing at the window of a building that had been waiting in a valley for 137 years, that this was the last piece of work he had left for her. Not a burden, not an unsolved problem passed on as an inheritance of difficulty. A direction, the specific forward direction that her father, who had always been the one to point forward when forward was not obvious, had found one last way to indicate. She turned from the window. There was work to be done. She began to look at what it was.